After the Galactic War, a human soldier receives a stunning alien slave. The shell hit 15 meters to his left and turned 3 Volkai soldiers into smoke. Sergeant Calvin Burke did not flinch. He had stopped flinching somewhere around the 4th month of fighting on Kale Station, when the screams stopped sounding like anything he recognized. He pressed his back against the crumbling wall of what used to be an orbital relay tower and reloaded his rifle with the slow, deliberate motion of a man who had done it 10,000 times before. "Burke, command says the eastern line is collapsing," his squadmate, a lanky corporal named Pete Hale, shouted over the noise. "Command said the western line was holding 2 hours ago," Calvin shouted back. "How did that turn out?" Pete did not answer. He already knew. The Battle of Kale Station was supposed to be the last major engagement of the Galactic War. 3 years of fighting across 11 star systems, 4 allied species, and more dead on both sides than anyone had the stomach to count. The Volkai Dominion had started it, and the Coalition was finishing it, but finishing it was costing every life that the finishing required. Calvin had watched his original squad of 8 become a squad of 2, not through dramatic last stands, but through the slow, grinding arithmetic of war. People stepped wrong. People trusted cover that wasn't cover. People ran when running was the worst option. He popped around the wall, fired twice, and pulled back before the return fire could find him. His shots found their marks. He did not look to confirm it. Confirmation was a luxury for people not still in the middle of being shot at. The fighting went on for another 6 hours. Calvin lost track of time somewhere around the 2nd hour, the way he always did. Time in combat moved differently. It stretched in the quiet seconds between movements and collapsed to nothing when the shooting started. When it was finally over, when the Volkai commanders on Kale Station sent their surrender signal, Calvin was sitting against the same wall where he had started, eating a cold ration bar and watching smoke rise from 3 different directions at once. Pete Hale sat next to him, one arm bandaged from a close graze, saying nothing. The silence after a battle was always the strangest part. Not peaceful, not calm, just empty, like the world had forgotten how to make noise and was slowly trying to remember. "That's it then," Pete finally said. "That's it," Calvin agreed. Neither of them moved for a long time. The war being over and a soldier's life being over were 2 very different things, but the Coalition military treated them as roughly the same. Within 72 hours of the Kale Station surrender, Calvin found himself sitting in a processing center on the transport ship the Ardent March, filling out forms on a digital pad while a bored logistics officer across the table reviewed his file. 3 years, 4 star systems, 11 confirmed engagements, the officer said, not looking up. 2 commendations, 1 field promotion, no disciplinary actions. "You're clean, Sergeant." "I tried," Calvin said. The officer looked up briefly, decided the comment wasn't worth engaging with, and looked back down. "Standard discharge package applies. Back pay will transfer within 30 days. You'll receive a transit voucher for any Coalition world of your choosing. Housing assistance for 90 days on arrival." He paused and tapped something on his pad. "There's also a secondary award allocation." Calvin waited. Per the Coalition Reparations Act, soldiers with 3 or more years of continuous service are eligible to receive a Volkai bondservant. It's part of the settlement terms the Dominion agreed to. Their people, voluntary submission to Coalition authority for a period of no less than 5 years, as both reparation and cultural exchange. The officer said it the way people say things they have explained too many times. "You're eligible. Do you want to be matched?" Calvin looked at him for a moment. He had heard about the bondservant program. Everyone had. It sat uncomfortably with most soldiers he knew, the idea of receiving a person as part of a military benefits package. It sat uncomfortably with him too, if he was being honest. "It's voluntary on their end," the officer added, as if reading his hesitation. "Nobody forced. They sign a compact same as a work agreement. You're responsible for their housing, food, and general welfare. They assist you with daily needs during reintegration. A lot of soldiers find it helps. Coming home is harder than it sounds. Calvin stared at the form on the pad in front of him. Coming home. He had a small apartment on Callaway Station that he had not seen in 3 years. No family waiting. His parents had both passed before the war. His sister had moved to one of the outer colony worlds, and they had drifted the way people drift when distance and silence go on long enough. "Fine," he said, and signed the form. He did not think much about it after that. He had other forms to fill out. She was standing in the intake corridor when they brought her out, and Calvin's first thought, absurdly, was that she was too still. Not frozen, not afraid. Simply still, in the way of someone who has learned that stillness is a form of armor. Her name, according to the compact document he had been given, was Viriel. She was Volkai, which meant she was roughly humanoid in shape but taller by half a head, with pale silver-blue skin that had a faint luminescent quality in the ship's artificial light. Her eyes were large and a deep amber color, with vertical pupils like a cat's. Her hair, which the Volkai grew in dense, silky ridges rather than individual strands, was a dark indigo color that fell past her shoulders. She was wearing a plain gray coalition-issue garment that fit her poorly, clearly designed for a human frame. She looked at him the way people look at something they have already decided about. Calvin looked at her the same way, then made an effort to stop. "Viriel," he said. "Yes," her voice was low and precise. Her coalition standard was slightly accented but entirely clear. "I'm Calvin Burke. I'm not sure what they told you about this arrangement." "They told me enough," she said. "I agreed to it." "Okay." He stood there for a second, aware that he was out of his depth in a social situation in a way he was almost never out of his depth in a military one. "I've got a place on Callaway Station. I haven't been there in 3 years. I don't actually know what state it's in." Something shifted in her expression, not quite amusement but close to it. "Neither do I," she said. "Right," he picked up his kit bag. "I guess we'll find out together." She fell into step beside him, and they walked toward the docking corridor, two strangers carrying the full, complicated weight of a war they had both survived from opposite sides. Callaway Station was a mid-sized orbital habitat that orbited a warm yellow star in the middle of nothing particularly important. It had been founded as a logistics hub and had grown sideways into a small city, the way places grow when people decide to stay because leaving requires more energy than it's worth. Calvin had lived there for 4 years before the war, working ship maintenance and taking night classes in systems engineering. It was not a glamorous place, but it was the closest thing to home he had. The apartment was on the 14th level of Sector 9, which the locals called the Old Quarter because it had been built in the first wave of construction and had never been properly renovated since. The corridors were narrow, and the lighting was slightly warmer than regulation required, and everything smelled faintly of recycled air and machine oil. Calvin had always found it comforting in the way that ugly, familiar things are comforting. He opened the apartment door, and they both looked inside. It was small. One main room that served as a living and sleeping space, a narrow kitchen along one wall, and a bathroom barely large enough for one person to turn around in. 3 years of absence had left a thin layer of dust over everything. His books were still stacked on the shelf by the window. His spare boots were still by the door. A mug he had left on the counter before shipping out was still there, long dry. "It's not much," he said. Viriel stepped inside and looked around slowly, taking in details the way she seemed to take in everything. "It's yours," she said, as if that was what mattered. Calvin did not know what to say to that, so he set down his bag and started opening the ventilation panels to clear the stale air. That first night, Calvin gave her the bed and took the couch without making a discussion of it. She did not argue, which he appreciated. He lay there in the dark, listening to the ambient hum of the station's systems, and thought about the fact that 3 days ago he had been in active combat, and now he was in his old apartment with an alien woman he did not know, both of them trying to figure out what came next. It was, he thought, a strange kind of ending to a strange kind of story. He fell asleep faster than he expected to, and for the first time in months, he did not wake up at every sound. The first week was mostly logistics. Calvin registered with the station housing office to update his residency. He visited the Coalition Veterans Assistance Center, which operated out of a small office near the transit hub, staffed by two tired-looking counselors who clearly had more cases than hours in their day. He filled out more forms. He waited in lines. Villarreal came with him to most of these things, not because it was required, but because she had nowhere else to be. She stood slightly behind him in lines, watched the station's residents with careful, observant eyes, and said nothing unless he spoke to her first. People stared. A Volkai in the old quarter of Callaway Station was not a common sight, especially not in the weeks immediately following the end of the war, when feelings were still raw and opinions were loud. Calvin ignored the stares. Villarreal appeared to do the same, though he suspected she noticed them more than she let on. On the third day, he found her in the kitchen, standing in front of the open refrigerator with an expression he could only describe as determined bafflement. "The temperature system," she said without turning around. "Your preservation units work differently from ours." "Cold keeps food from going bad," he said. "That's mostly what it does." "I understand the function." She turned and looked at him. "I'm trying to understand the arrangement, where things go and why." He spent 20 minutes explaining the layout of his refrigerator, which was not something he had ever expected to have to do, and she listened with the same focused attention she gave to everything, asking two precise questions and then nodding once firmly, as if the matter was now resolved. She cooked dinner that night. She used what was in the refrigerator and the dry goods shelf, consulted the station's public recipe network on the screen in the kitchen, and produced something that was close enough to a familiar stew that Calvin ate 2 bowls of it without thinking too hard about the unfamiliar spices she had added to it. "This is good," he said. "It's adequate," she said, which he was beginning to understand was her version of the same thing. They ate in comfortable silence, and Calvin realized, somewhere between the first bowl and the second, that the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like two people who were both tired of noise learning, slowly and carefully, how to share quiet. The second week brought complications, as second weeks tend to do. Calvin was walking back from the transit hub when 3 men stopped him in the corridor near the entrance to Sector 9. He recognized the type immediately. Not dangerous in any organized way, just aggressively unhappy and looking for a place to put it. One of them he half recognized from before the war, a man named Greg who had worked cargo loading and had strong opinions about things he understood poorly. "Heard you came back with a Volkai," Greg said, planting himself in the middle of the corridor. "They giving those out now, like pets." Calvin stopped walking. He kept his hands loose at his sides. "Move out of my way, Greg." "People died in that war," Greg said. "People from the station, you know that." "I was in the war," Calvin said evenly. "I know what people did in it." "And you come back with one of them living in your apartment." Greg shook his head with the theatrical disgust of someone who had rehearsed being offended. "Don't that seem wrong to you?" Calvin looked at him for a moment. He thought about how much he did not want this conversation. He thought about everything he had seen in 3 years, and how much of it he had never chosen, and how little patience he had for people who picked their battles from a position of total safety. "Go home, Greg," he said and walked around him. Greg said something else at his back. Calvin did not stop. He had learned a long time ago that some arguments were not about being right and not about being wrong. They were just about whether you were willing to give someone the satisfaction of a reaction. He was not willing. When he got back to the apartment, Villarreal was on the small balcony that looked out over the station's central atrium. She was standing very still, watching the lights of the level below. She heard him come in and turned. There was a problem, she said. She read people well, he was already noticing that. Small one, he said, nothing serious. She looked at him for a moment with those amber eyes, vertical pupils contracted slightly in the bright light from the atrium. Then she looked back out at the station. I am aware that my presence here is not simple, she said. Calvin leaned in the doorway. Most things worth doing aren't simple. She turned her head slightly to look at him again. The expression on her face was hard to read. The Volkai had a different range of facial movement than humans, subtler in some ways and sharper in others, and he was still learning the vocabulary of it. Why did you choose the bondservant program? She asked. He considered lying or giving the easy answer about reintegration assistance. Then he decided she had earned honesty. I didn't have a good reason, he said. I just said yes to a form. I think I was tired and I didn't know what to do with myself. He paused. Why did you volunteer? She was quiet for a few seconds. Because staying in Volkai space after the war would have required pretending the war had gone differently than it did. I could not do that. He understood that more than she probably knew. So we're both figuring it out, he said. It appears so, she said, and turned back to watching the lights. The Veterans Assistance Center held group sessions twice a week, and Calvin had promised one of the counselors, a calm woman named Dr. Paula Hendricks, that he would attend at least 3 of them before deciding they were useless. He went to the first one with low expectations, sat in a circle of folding chairs with 8 other veterans, and spent an hour listening to people talk about things he recognized but had no words for. He did not say much that first session, he mostly listened. But he went back the second week, and the week after that, and by the 4th session he was talking, haltingly at first and then with more ease, about the specific texture of what it felt like to be in a place where everything required survival, and then suddenly be in a place where nothing did. Villarreal waited for him outside after the first session he spoke in. She was sitting on a bench near the corridor entrance, reading something on a small pad she had found in the station's public lending library. How was it? She asked. Useful, he said, which surprised him. She marked her page and stood. Good. They walked back together. Somewhere between the transit hub and Sector 9, he told her a small piece of something he had said in the session, nothing dramatic, just a detail about a moment on Kale Station when he had realized the war was actually going to end. She listened without interrupting. She asked one question, precise and thoughtful, about what that realization had felt like in the body rather than in the mind. He had to think about it for a long time before he answered. Nobody had ever asked him that question before. Most people asked what he had done, or what he had seen, as if war was only ever about events rather than the way events leave marks on the inside of a person. Like my legs were suddenly too heavy, he finally said. Like I had been carrying weight I had gotten so used to I forgot it was there, and then I remembered all at once. She nodded slowly. Yes, she said quietly, as if she knew exactly what he meant. He thought she probably did. The Volkai Bond Compact required Villarreal to register with the station's administrative office, which she did in the second week, and to check in with a coalition liaison officer once a month, which she also did. Beyond those formalities, her time was largely her own. She was not a prisoner or a servant in any practical sense of the word. She was more like a person who had arrived in a new place with very little and was carefully, methodically building a life in it. She found the station's public library within the first week and began working through its records on human culture, history, and social structure with the same focused discipline she applied to everything. She found the station's small market and learned where things were, and which vendors were reliable, and which ones rounded up when they thought you weren't watching. She found a small garden level near the top of Sector 9, where the station's environmental systems kept real plants growing, not for food but for the psychological benefit of green things, and she went there in the mornings when Calvin was still asleep. He found out about the garden by accident, when he woke early one morning and she wasn't in the apartment. He almost panicked, which told him something about how quickly his brain had recalibrated to expecting her presence. He checked the station's public location registry, found her signal near the top of the sector, and went up to look. The garden level was small and humid and smelled like actual earth, which was a smell Calvin had almost forgotten existed. Viriel was sitting on a bench between two large fern-like plants, her eyes closed, her hands flat on her knees. She was perfectly still in that way she had. He started to back up quietly, but she spoke without opening her eyes. "You do not have to leave," she said. He sat down on the other end of the bench. Neither of them said anything for a while. The garden made soft sounds, the drip of the irrigation system, the hum of the grow lights overhead. Something that might have been a small bird, released into the level to control insects, rustled in the leaves somewhere to the left. "Do you miss home?" he asked, which was probably too blunt, but he had never been good at working up to things. She opened her eyes. She looked at the plants in front of them rather than at him. "The place I grew up in no longer exists," she said. "The region was a battle zone in the second year of the war. I don't know what's left of it." A pause. "So I miss something that is already gone, which is different from missing a place you could return to." He understood that too. "I grew up on a colony world called Maris 4, he said. "My parents are both gone. My sister is somewhere I haven't spoken to in 2 years." He thought about it. "I think I've been homesick for something that was already over before the war started, just didn't know it." She looked at him then, with that careful, amber-eyed attention of hers. "What do you do with that?" she asked. "I'm trying to figure that out," he said honestly. She looked back at the plants. "So am I," she said. They stayed in the garden for another hour, saying very little, which was enough. In the 5th week, Calvin got a job offer. An old contact from his pre-war maintenance work, a short and perpetually caffeinated station engineer named Doug Pell, had heard he was back and reached out. There was a position on the station's outer maintenance crew, not glamorous, nothing that required his military experience, just physical and technical work on the exterior hull systems in a suit. Calvin took it without hesitation. He told Viriel over dinner. She looked up from her bowl. "Is this what you want?" "It's what I know how to do," he said. "That's close enough for now." She thought about this. "I want to find work as well," she said. He had been wondering when she would bring it up. She was not the kind of person who would accept indefinite dependence on someone else, which he respected even though the bond compact technically did not require her to do anything. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I was a data analyst in the Dominion," she said. "Mathematical systems, logistics modeling. I do not know if those skills translate here." "They probably do," he said. "The math works the same everywhere." "The politics may not," she said dryly. He almost laughed. It was the driest joke he had heard from her yet, and he was learning that dry humor was actually one of her fluent languages. "I'll ask Doug if he knows anyone at the station's logistics office," he said. "The coalition is trying to rebuild trade routes. They need people who understand large-scale movement modeling." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was getting better at reading. Gratitude, but not the kind that made itself small or apologetic. The kind that recognized help without needing to diminish itself. "Thank you," she said. "It's nothing," he said. "It is not nothing," she said, firmly and without drama, and went back to her dinner. He got the contact through Doug. Viriel put together a credentials document, drawing on her records from before the war, and sent it to the station's logistics coordination office. She received an interview request 4 days later. She prepared for it with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to everything, researching the office's current projects, cross-referencing her own experience with the specific problems they were working on, and practicing her coalition standard vocabulary for technical terms she had only previously encountered in Vokai translation. Calvin did not help with the preparation, because she did not need him to. He noticed this, and noticed that he was glad about it, in a quiet way he couldn't entirely articulate. The morning of the interview, she came out of the bathroom in a set of clothes she had quietly acquired over the past few weeks. Nothing elaborate, dark trousers, and a simple long-sleeved top in deep blue that was the first thing he had seen her wear that actually fit her frame properly. She had done something with her indigo hair, the ridges gathered back in a way that looked intentional and precise. She looked at him with an expression that was trying hard to be neutral. "Does this convey competence?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without needing to think about it. She nodded once. "Good," she said, and left. She came back 3 hours later and went directly to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water and drank it slowly, standing at the counter with her back to the room. Calvin waited. "They offered me a provisional contract," she said, to the wall. 3 months. If the work meets expectations, it becomes permanent." "That's good," he said. She turned around. Her expression was doing several things at once, and he was far enough along in reading her now that he could recognize what it was: relief, and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from having worked very hard not to let anyone see how much something mattered. "Yes," she said, "it is good." He smiled. He had not smiled easily in a long time, but this one came without any effort at all. The season changed on the station, not in temperature, but in the angle of the artificial lighting that the habitat used to simulate day cycles. The lights shifted slightly warmer, slightly lower at the edges of each simulated day, mimicking the feel of autumn on a planet neither of them had grown up on. Calvin noticed it without thinking about it, the way you notice things that have always been part of your background. He and Pete Hale met for a meal one evening. Pete had been stationed closer to home and had already been back for a month, was already looking steadier, some color back in his face and the tightness around his eyes less pronounced. They sat in a small food stall in the market level and ate noodle bowls and talked around the war more than they talked about it, which was the right approach, most of the time. "How's the Vorkai woman?" Pete asked, not unkindly. "Her name is Viruale," Calvin said. "She got a contract at the logistics office." Pete raised his eyebrows. "Yeah, she's settling in okay." "Better than I am," Calvin said, which was honest. Pete studied him for a second. "You seem better, though, than I expected." Calvin thought about the garden level and dinners that were becoming a rhythm and the dry jokes, and the way she asked precise questions about things nobody else had ever thought to ask. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." Something shifted between them around the 8th week, and Calvin recognized it the same way you recognize weather changing, gradually and then all at once. It was not dramatic. There was no moment of crisis or revelation. It was more like a series of small things that accumulated until the weight of them was undeniable. It was the way she had started leaving a light on when she went to bed before him, small thing, possibly unconscious. It was the way she had learned exactly how he took his coffee, without being asked and without making any remark about it, and just started making it that way. It was the way they had started finishing each other's thoughts in conversation, not dramatically, just the ordinary finish-your-sentence familiarity of two people who had been paying careful attention to each other. It was the evening she came home from the logistics office looking truly tired for the first time, the kind of tired that goes past the body and into the person, and sat down on the couch and said nothing, and he sat down next to her and also said nothing, and it was exactly the right response, and he knew it because she stayed exactly where she was instead of pulling back into herself the way she did when space was what she needed. They sat in silence for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "The data model I've been building for the new Lyran trade corridor has a problem I can't find." "Tell me," he said. She spent 20 minutes explaining a logistics problem that was several levels above his mathematical comfort zone, and he spent 20 minutes asking questions that were mostly wrong but occasionally pointed at the right thing. And by the end of it she had found the problem, which was not because of anything he had contributed technically, but because explaining something out loud to someone who is genuinely listening, is one of the most powerful problem-solving tools in existence. Got it, she said, with quiet satisfaction. Good, he said. She looked at him, and her expression was open in a way it had not been when they had first met in that intake corridor when she had worn stillness like armor. The armor was not gone. It was just resting. Calvin, she said. Yeah. I am glad I signed the compact. He looked at her for a moment. The station's lights were at their warmest evening setting, and she looked less silver and more gold in that light, the luminescence of her skin soft rather than sharp. Her amber eyes were steady on his. I'm glad you did too, he said. There was a pause, the kind that isn't empty but full. The compact has a clause, she said, about amendment by mutual agreement. I know, he said. He had read the whole document, he read everything. I would like to discuss that clause, she said, when you're ready. I'm ready now, he said, which surprised him by being completely true. She looked at him for another moment with those careful eyes, and then she did something he had not seen her do before. She smiled, not the almost amusement expression he had learned early, but a real one, full and unguarded, that changed her face entirely. He thought it was the most disarming thing he had ever seen, and he had been through a war. Then we should talk, she said. They talked for 3 hours that night, sitting across from each other at the small table in the kitchen, with the lights low and 2 mugs of tea going cold between them. They talked about the compact and what it meant and what it didn't mean, and what they both wanted it to mean, and the things they were afraid of, and the things they were not afraid of anymore. They talked about what came after the compound restructuring clause, not with any urgency but with the careful, honest attention that 2 people give to something they have both decided is worth being careful and honest about. At some point past midnight, the station's public announcement system chimed once, the soft sound it made at the shift of the artificial day, and they both registered it and kept talking. When they finally stopped, it was not because they had run out of things to say. It was because they had reached the natural resting place of a conversation that could be continued, which was the best kind of conversation there was. Calvin walked to the window that looked out over the atrium. The station's night cycle had taken all the color out of the light and left only the cool blue of standby systems and the occasional warm point of somebody's window still lit in the dark. Vierail came to stand beside him. For a long time, they were just 2 people looking at a place they had both arrived at from very different directions, and somehow both ended up choosing. Do you know what I thought, Calvin said, when I first saw you in that corridor on the ship? That I was too still, she said. He turned to look at her. How did you know that? Because I thought the same about you, she said. A man who had learned that stillness was a form of armor. He looked at her for a moment, and then out at the lights, and then at her again. I think I'm done with armor, he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the station, at this small, unglamorous place that smelled of recycled air and machine oil, and had become, without either of them fully planning it, something like home. Yes, she said softly, so am I. Outside the window, Callaway Station turned slowly in the dark around its warm yellow star, and inside, 2 people who had both survived the end of a world were quietly, carefully, beginning to build a new one. Not all endings are loss, some of them are doors,